Top 30 Doctor Who Stories Ever 3. 20 to 11. 20. The Time Meddler. The climax to the second season of Doctor Who is my favourite William Hartnell story and thus the only first Doctor story in my all-time top 20. The Time Meddler is a droll story that is the very first pseudo-historical story in the series. Up to this point the historical stories had been very much divorced from the more overt science fiction stories, but from this point the possibility of playing out science fiction stories in historical periods became more pronounced. It is also, of course, the first time we found out that the Doctor was not in fact the only person to have a TARDIS, as we meet the monk, brilliantly played by Peter Butterworth, as a sort of amoral precursor to the persona of the second Doctor. William Hartnell is on top form, the direction is exemplary, and the new companion team of Stephen and Vicky is also excellent and very promising, impressively filling the large hole left by the departure of the amazing Ian and Barbara in the previous story. All in all, The Time Meddler is a gently humorous, enormously atmospheric and above all wonderfully fun story to watch. 19. Day of the Daleks. The opening story to Season 9, one of the very worst seasons in the original 26-season run, is ironically one of the best stories ever. Day of the Daleks is a remarkably intelligent, ambitious and hard science fiction story that echoes many of the themes and ideas that would later to be seen in the iconic Terminator series, the first film of which would not be made for another 12 years after this story was shown on television. Jon Pertwee gives one of his best performances in this excellent story with a remarkably dark and nihilistic science fiction premise, and it is one of the very best stories of his entire 5-year run, as well as one of the best and most underrated Dalek stories ever made. 18. The Seeds of Doom. The Seeds of Doom is the closing story of the rather overrated Season 13, but this one itself certainly isn't overrated. Seeds is one of the best action horror stories in the entire series, featuring some chilling and blood-curdling scenes you would never see in the modern show in a million years. Tom Baker is on ferocious form, and while I've always felt the Fourth Doctor and Sarah team to be rather overrated as well, here they are both in peak form. Tony Beckley is a fantastically loony villain, and John Challis, otherwise known as Boycie from British sitcom Only Fools and Horses, is also fabulous as the brutal mercenary Scorby, who switches sides purely for the sake of his own self-preservation. The Seeds of Doom is a pure thrill ride from start to finish. 17. Sharda. The climax to Season 17 that never was, or at least not until 1992. Sharda is the Douglas Adams story that was half made in 1979 only to get nobbled by BBC strikes. Fortunately in 1992 the ever-enterprising John Nathan Turner, the last producer of Classic Who, not only cobbled together the existing footage and added sound effects, special effects and music, but also managed to cajole Tom Baker back into adding a frequently hilariously deranged narration for all of the missing parts and had it released on video, at which point it immediately became one of my very favorite stories of all time. Sharda is funny, good-natured and with some wonderfully wacky ideas and a terrific guest cast and lovely location shooting in Cambridge. Released on DVD in 2012 in its original VHS form, the story remains an absolute delight and is far more than just a historical curiosity. It is one of my most loved stories of all time and one last blast of glorious Williams-era creativity, fun and madness. 16. Remembrance of the Daleks. The first story of the anniversary Season 25 in 1988, Remembrance helped right the ship that was Doctor Who after a troubled couple of seasons by starting the year off with one of the best Doctor Who stories and pretty much the best Dalek story of all time. Sylvester McCoy reinvents his Doctor as a more manipulative figure with engaging shades of grey, and his partnership with new companion Sophie Aldred as the much-loved Ace helps further propel this story into the ranks of an all-time classic. Beautifully acted, written and produced, Remembrance is as fast-paced and exciting as it was nearly 30 years. Holy shit. ago and is rarely out of any Who fans' top 20. 15. The Time Warrior. The first story of Season 11, the fifth and final season to star Jon Pertwee as the Third Doctor, The Time Warrior is often noted as a story of notable firsts. The first story to feature the Sontarans, the first story to feature Sarah Jane Smith, and the first story to name the Doctor's home planet as Gallifrey. As notable as all those first are, however, they are not why this story is in my top 20 stories of all time. The Time Warrior is on this list simply because it is an absolute fucking riot from start to finish. The script is one of legendary Who writer Robert Holmes' funniest and the cast are fantastic, including Kevin Lindsay, still the definitive Sontaran even more than 4 decades later, and David Dacre, who chews on both the hilarious cod medieval dialogue and the scenery with equally OTT aplomb. The Time Warrior is as much fun as Who gets. 14. The Sunmakers. The fourth story of Season 15. The first season of my favorite Doctor Who producer, Graham Williams, is a masterfully underrated, acidic and brilliantly witty satire on taxation and cold-blooded corporatism, and is the second story in my top 20 to come from the pen of the peerless Robert Holmes. The Sunmakers is biting and seditious, and yet avoids being some pompous sermon on the evils of capitalism by being so bloody funny throughout. This is also the first story to really start to treat K9 as a character rather than just a tool, a development that would contribute enormously to his popularity throughout the rest of the Tom Baker era. 13. The Horns of Neyman. If there is any story in the entire history of Doctor Who, classic and new series alike, that is more underrated and misunderstood than this one, I've yet to find it. The Horns of Neyman is a shamelessly entertaining comedy story that takes a traditional, witty and smartly written story and turns it on its head into becoming a deliciously hilarious send-up of the series' own tropes. Lalla Ward makes the thing even funnier by playing it deadly straight as a fiery Romana, while Tom Baker and Graham Crowden do the exact opposite. I first saw this on Aussie TV back in the early 90s, already being aware that its reputation among Who fans was slightly less lovely than Lucifer, and was utterly baffled by the fun and entertaining story that I actually saw. Over the years, while some stories I initially thought were good or okay have sunk further in my estimation, Hello Pyramids of Mars and Tomb of the Cybermen, Neyman has only gone up and up and up every single time I watch it. Absolutely killer entertainment, though admittedly it's not recommended for those many Who fans with a terminal sense of humor bypass. 12. Ghostlight. The second story of the amazing Season 26, the final season of Classic Who in 1989, is often derided by the less intelligent members of fandom for being too complex. Yet I've never found it overly difficult to understand and find its complicated nature is rather overhyped by the kind of fans who regard Planet of the Daleks as a riveting thriller. Tee-hee chuckle guffaw titter. Ghostlight is an atmospheric masterpiece, a warped Victorian ghost story that's actually a warped Victorian science fiction story and contains a fabulous mansion set, amazing direction and music, a fantastic guest cast and arguably the best performances from Sylvester and Sophie. A masterpiece. 11. The Androids of Terra. The fourth story of Season 16, the Key to Time season that was Graham Williams' sophomore year as the show's producer, has often been described as a free adaptation of the novel The Prisoner of Zenda. Like most people who call it that, I've never seen The Prisoner of Zenda and have little interest in doing so, because The Androids of Terra is a wonderful mix of swashbuckling romantic adventure, fairy tale and science fiction story that stands entirely on its own as a truly wonderful Doctor Who story. Tom Baker and Mary Tam are clearly having a ball, as is Peter Jeffrey as the delightful Cadcount Grendel. There's more wit than in almost any other story save those written by Robert Holmes, and the climax is a rather fantastically well-staged sword fight between Tom and Grendel. For sheer entertainment value, The Androids of Terra is hard to beat. To be continued.